Good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well today. This afternoon, we are going to read through chapter 53 of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens. But we're not just going to read the words. We're going to stop and talk about interesting words and vocabulary, or interesting phrases and vocabulary. So if you are a learner of English, then this would be a good way, especially if you're very advanced, to pick up some new words or phrases or discover the deeper meaning of certain things. So, and we're also doing this live, all right? So if you're watching this with me, if you're reading this with me together live, then I encourage you to make questions in the chat. If you don't ask questions, then I will just stop sometimes and explain words that I think probably you don't know or might be useful or interesting to you. But don't think you're interrupting me. I want you to make questions. I want you to ask questions as we go. All right, well, let's get started with chapter 53. We're getting very close to the end of this book. Another retrospect. I must pause yet once again. Oh, my child wife. There is a figure in the moving crowd before my memory, quiet and still, saying in its innocent love and childish beauty, stop to think of me. Turn to look upon the little blossom as it fluttered. We've seen that word many times. Flutter, that's the movement of a butterfly's wings or a bird's wings. Turn to look upon the little blossom as it flutters to the ground. I do. All else grows dim and fades away, and I'm again with Dora in our cottage. I do not know how long she's been ill. I'm so used to it in feeling that I cannot count the time. It's not really long in weeks or months, but in my usage and experience, it's weary. Weary while. Weary means tired. They've left off telling me to wait a few days more, and I've begun to fear, remotely, that the day may never shine when I shall see my child wife running in the sunlight with her old friend Jip. He is, as it were, suddenly grown very old. It may be that he misses his mistress, something that enlivened him and made him younger, but he mopes. Moping is walking around looking very sad. But he mopes, and his sight is weak, and his limbs are feeble. And my aunt is sorry that he objects to her no more. Jip is Dora's dog, and he only liked Dora. So if anyone else came near Dora, he would bite and growl and bark. And now he doesn't care anymore. So the aunt feels sorry that Jip no longer barks at her and tries to keep her away from Dora. But creeps near her. Creeping is going very slowly. Very quietly, very slowly. He creeps near her and lies on Dora's bed. She, sitting at the bedside, mildly licks her hand. Dora lies smiling on us and is beautiful and utters no hasty or complaining word. She says that we are very good to her, that her dear old careful boy is tiring himself out. She knows that my aunt has no sleep, yet is always wakeful, active, and kind. Sometimes the little bird-like ladies come to see her, and then we talk about our wedding day and all that happy time. What a strange rest and pause in my life there seems to be. And in all life, within doors and without, when I sit in the quiet, shaded, orderly room with the blue eyes of my child wife turned towards me, and her little fingers twining round my hand, many and many an hour I sit thus. But of all those times, 3 times come the freshest on my mind. It is morning, and Dora, made so trim by my aunt's hands, shows me how her pretty hair will curl upon the pillow yet, and how long and bright it is, and how she likes to have it loosely gathered in that net she wears. Not that I'm vain of it now, you mocking boy, she says when I smile, but because you used to say you thought it was so beautiful, and because when I first began to think about you, I used to peep in the glass and wonder whether you would like very much to have a lock of it. So remember, a lock of hair is like a collection of hair like this. This is, if I cut this and give it to you, I say, here's a lock of my hair. And that used to be a way that people would remember other people. Instead of taking a picture, because there were no cameras. I used to peep in the glass. The glass is a mirror. So I used to look in the mirror and wonder whether you would want a lock of my hair. Oh, what a foolish fellow you were, Dodie, when I gave you one. That was on the day when you were painting the flowers I had given you, Dora, and when I told you how much in love I was. But I didn't like to tell you, says Dora, then how I had cried over them, because I believe you really liked me. When I can run about again, as I used to do, Dodie, let us go and see those places where we were such a silly couple, shall we? And take some of the old walks, and not forget poor Papa. Yes, we will, and have some happy days. So you must make haste and get well, my dear. Oh, I shall soon do that. I'm so much better. You don't know. It's evening, and I sit in the same chair, by the same bed, with the same face turned towards me. We've been silent, and there's a smile upon her face. I have ceased to carry my light burden up and down the stairs. A burden is something that you have to carry that's heavy and difficult. So he says, I don't carry my burden up the stairs and down the stairs anymore. I don't carry her up and down. She stays in bed. She stays in her bed. She lies here all day. Dodie, my dear Dora. You won't think what I'm going to say unreasonable after what you told me such a little while ago of Mr. Wickfield's not being well. I want to see Agnes. Very much I want to see her. I'll write a letter to her, my dear. Will you? Directly. What a good, kind boy. Dodie, take me on your arm. Indeed, my dear. It's not a whim. It's not a foolish fancy. I want very much indeed to see her. I'm certain of it. I have only to tell her so, and she's sure to come. You're very lonely when you go downstairs now, Dora whispers with her arm around my neck. How can I be otherwise, my own love, when I see your empty chair? My empty chair. She clings to me for a little while, in silence. And you really miss me, Dodie? Looking up, brightly smiling, even poor, giddy, stupid me? My heart, who is there upon earth that I could miss so much? Oh, husband, I'm so glad, yet so sorry, creeping closer to me and folding me in both her arms. She laughs and sobs and then is quiet and quite happy. Quite, she says. Only give Agnes my dear love and tell her that I want very, very much to see her, and I have nothing left to wish for. Except to get well again, Dora. Oh, Dodie. Sometimes I think, I always was a little silly thing that will never be. I won't if I can help it, Dodie, but I'm very happy, though my dear boy is so lonely by himself before his child wife's empty chair. It's night, and I'm with her still. Agnes has arrived, has been among us for a whole day and an evening, and she and my aunt and I have sat with Dora since the morning, all together. We haven't talked much, but Dora's been perfectly contented and cheerful, and we are now alone. Do I know now that my child wife will soon leave me? They've told me so. They've told me nothing new to my thoughts, but I'm far from sure that I have taken that truth to heart. I cannot master it. I have withdrawn by myself so many times today to weep. I have remembered who wept for parting between the living and the dead. I have bethought me of all the gracious and compassionate history. I have tried to resign myself. To resign yourself means to give up fighting, to just accept what's going to happen, and to console myself. And that I hope I may have done imperfectly, but I cannot firmly settle in my mind is that the end will absolutely come. I hold her hand in mine. I hold her heart in mine. I see her love for me, alive in all its strength. I cannot shut out a pale, lingering shadow of belief that she will be spared. I'm going to speak to you, Dodie. I'm going to say something I have often thought of saying lately, You won't mind? With a gentle look. Mind, darling. Because I don't know what you will think, or what you may have thought sometimes. Perhaps you have often thought the same, Dodie. Dear, I'm afraid I was too young. I lay my face upon the pillow by her, and she looks into my eyes and speaks very softly, gradually, as she goes on. I feel with a stricken heart that she is speaking of herself as past. I'm afraid, dear, I was too young. I don't mean in years only, but in experience and thoughts and everything. I was such a silly little creature. I'm afraid of it. I'm afraid it would have been better if we had only loved each other as boy and girl and forgotten it. I've begun to think I was not fit to be a wife. I try to stay my tears, to reply, "Oh, Dora, love, as fit as I to be a husband?" I don't know. With the old shake of her curls, perhaps. But if I had been more fit to be married, I might have made you more so, too. Besides, you are very clever. I never was. We've been very happy, my sweet Dora. I was very happy. Very. But as years went on, oh, my dear boy would have wearied of his child wife. She would have been less and less of a companion for him. He would have been more and more sensible of what was wanting in his home. She wouldn't have improved. It is better as it is. Oh, Dora. Dearest, dearest, do not speak to me so. Every word seems a reproach. No, not a syllable, she answers, kissing me. Oh, my dear, you never deserved it. I loved you far too well to say a reproachful word to you in earnest. It was all the merit I had, except being pretty, or you thought me so. Is it lonely downstairs, Dodie? Very, very. Don't cry. Is my chair there? It's in its old place. Oh, how my poor boy cries. Hush, hush. Now make me one promise. I want to speak to Agnes. When you go downstairs, tell Agnes so, and send her up to me. And while I speak to her, let no one come, not even Aunt. I want to speak to Agnes by herself. I want to speak to Agnes quite alone. I promise that she shall immediately, but I cannot leave her for my grief. I said that it was better as it is, she whispers, as she holds me in her arms. Oh, Dodie, after more years, you never could have loved your child wife better than you do. And after more years, she would not have tried and disappointed you, that you might have been able to, that you might not have been able to love her half so well. I know I was too young and foolish. It's much better as it is. Agnes is downstairs. When I go into the parlor and I give her the message, she disappears, leaving me alone with Jip. His Chinese house is by the fire, and he lies within it on his bed of flannel, querulously trying to sleep. The bright moon is high and clear. As I look out the window, my tears fall fast, and my undisciplined heart is chastened heavily. I sit down by the fire, thinking with a blind remorse of all those secret feelings I have nourished since my marriage. I think of every little trifle between me and Dora, and I feel the truth that trifles make the sum of life. Remember, trifles are little things, the little things. So all the little things is what life is made of. Ever rising from the sea of my remembrance is the image of the dear child. I knew her first, graced by my young love, and by her own, with every fascination wherein such love is rich. Would it indeed have been better if we had loved each other as boy and girl, and forgotten it? Undisciplined heart, reply. How the time wears, I know not, until I'm recalled by my child wife's old companion. More restless than he was, he crawls out of his house and looks at me and wanders to the door and whines to go upstairs. Not tonight, Chip. Not tonight. He comes back very slowly to me, licks my hand, and lifts his dim eyes on my face. Oh, Chip, it may be never again. He lies down at my feet and stretches himself out as if to sleep, and with a plaintive cry, is dead. Oh, Agnes, Agnes, look here! That face so full of pity and of grief, that rain of tears, that awful mute appeal to me, that solemn hand upraised towards heaven. Agnes? It's over. Darkness comes before my eyes, and for a time all things are blotted out of my remembrance. Okay, well, that was the end of chapter 53 of David Copperfield. That was a very short chapter, so we will continue reading with chapter 54 now. But first, I'm just going to take a 1-minute break. All right, we're back. Wow. Chapter 52 was quite a chapter. It was short but powerful. Okay, let's continue reading. Let's go into chapter 54. Mr. Micawber's Transactions. This is not the time at which I am to enter on the state of my mind beneath its load of sorrow. I came to think that the future was walled up before me, that the energy and action of my life were at an end, that I never could find any refuge but in the grave. I came to think so, I say, but not in the first shock of my grief. It slowly grew to that. If the events I go on to relate had not thickened around me, in the beginning to confuse, and in the end to augment. Augment means like adding something. To my affliction, it is possible, though I think not probable, that I might have fallen at once into this condition. As it was, an interval occurred before I fully knew my own distress, an interval in which I even supposed that its sharpest pangs were past. And when my mind could soothe itself by resting on all that was most innocent and beautiful in the tender story that was closed forever. When it was first proposed that I should go abroad, or how it came to be agreed among us that I was to seek the restoration of my peace and change and travel, I do not even now distinctly know. The spirit of Agnes so pervaded all we thought and said and did. In that time of sorrow, that I assume I may refer the project to her influence. But her influence was so quiet that I know no more. And now indeed I began to think that in my old association of her, that was the stained glass window in the church, a prophetic foreshadowing of what she would be to me in the calamity that was to happen in the fullness of time, had found a way into my mind. In all that sorrow, from the moment never to be forgotten, when she stood before me with her upraised hand. She was like a sacred presence in my lonely house when the angel of death alighted there. My child wife fell asleep. They told me so when I could bear to hear it on her bosom with a smile. From my swoon I first awoke to a consciousness of her compassionate tears, her words of hope. Oh, sorry, Miriam, I didn't see you said calamity. Calamity is like a... it's like a horrible thing that happens, a catastrophic thing that happens. But let me just check that. An event that causes great or sudden damage or distress, a disaster. Where was the word calamity? I don't remember it. Oh, I can't find it. I first awoke. I'm sorry, I can't find it. I first awoke to a I first awoke to a consciousness of her compassionate tears, her words of hope and peace, her gentle face bending down from a purer region nearer heaven over my undisciplined heart, and softening pain. Oh, you said it was there, but I don't see it. Let me go on. I was to go abroad. That seemed to have been determined among us from the first, the ground now covering all that could perish of my departed wife. I waited only for what Mr. Micawber called the final pulverization of heap, and for the departure of emigrants. At the request of Traddles, most affectionate and devoted of friends in my trouble, we returned to Canterbury. Pulverize is like making a powder of something. That comes from the word polvo, which means powder. So, if you're, wait, let me get a picture of something here. This is a mortar and pestle, so maybe you recognize this. So if you're cooking something or you're making food and you do this first, this is pulverizing something. So now they're doing the final pulverization of heap. At the request of Traddles, most affectionate and devoted of friends in my trouble, we returned to Canterbury. I mean, my aunt, Agnes, and I. We proceeded by appointment straight to Mr. Micawber's house, where, and at Mr. Wickfield's, my friend, had been laboring ever since our explosive meeting. When poor Mrs. Micawber saw me come in, my black clothes, she was sensibly affected. There was a great deal of good in Mrs. Micawber's heart, which had not been done out of it those many years. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Micawber was my aunt's first salutation after we were seated. Pray, have you thought about that emigration proposal of mine? My dear madam, returned Mr. Micawber, perhaps I cannot better express the conclusion at which Mrs. Micawber, your humble servant. Miriam said, what happened? Agnes died? No, Agnes didn't die. Davy's wife died. So right now we're just starting chapter 54? Yeah, so I just did 53. It's a very short chapter, but it's a very sad chapter where Dora dies. And so now Davy's single. He's a bachelor again. He's a widower. A woman, when her husband dies, is called a widow, and when the wife dies, the man is called a widower. So now Davy is a widower. So that just happened, and now, but there's one final thing that they have to do to Uriah Heep. Oh, it's a very sad chapter. You should just go and listen to it. It was very hard to read that. I've been I don't know when I started reading this book. Maybe I don't know, in December of last year, because I don't read it all the time. But it's getting close to at least half a year, maybe more. And it's such a long book that it's like you start to feel like you know everybody in the book, and you get attached to the stories. Okay, when it was first proposed that I should... Oh, wait. I've really missed it here. My dear madam, returned Mr. Micawber, perhaps I cannot better express the conclusion at which Mrs. Micawber, your humble servant, and I may add our children, May I add, our children have jointly and severally arrived, than by borrowing the language of an illustrious poet to reply that our boat is on the shore and our bark is on the sea. That's right, said my aunt. I augur all sort of good from your sensible demand. Madam, you do us a great deal of honor. Miriam is asking about illustrious. Illustrious means, to me it kind of means like admired, but let me just see what Google has to say about that. I'm sure I'm probably wrong. Well known, respected, admired, yeah. So where did we see the word illustrious? An illustrious poet, so a famous poet, a well-admired poet. He then referred to a memorandum with respect to the pecuniary assistance enabling us to launch our frail canoe on the ocean of enterprise. I have reconsidered that important business point, and would beg to propose my notes of hand, drawn. It is needless to stipulate on stamps of the amounts respectively required by the various acts of Parliament applying to such securities at 18, 24, and 3 months. You don't worry, I don't really understand what he's talking about. He's just talking about the way he speaks is very crazy. But he's talking about needing some money to go to Australia, and also some kind of government paperwork. The proposition I originally submitted was 12, 18, and 24. So he's talking about money. But I'm apprehensive that such an arrangement might not allow sufficient time for the requisite amount of something to turn up. We might not, said Mr. Micawber, looking round the room as if it represented several hundred acres of highly cultivated land, on the first responsibility becoming due, have been successful in our harvest, or we might not have our harvest in. Labor, I believe, is sometimes difficult to obtain in that portion of our colonial possessions where it will be our lot to combat with a teeming soil. So Mr. Micawber is saying, we want to go to Australia, but I don't think we'll have enough money, because when we arrive and if we buy some farmland, there won't be enough time or enough people, laborers, to work to make enough money. So I need more money. Miriam is asking about the word stipulate. Let's look that up. I know that word, and it's a word that you would use when you're talking about something like a contract. It's like a condition. But stipulate. Let me just see what Google says. To make an agreement or covenant, to do or forbear something. To demand an express term in an agreement. So a stipulation is like a condition. Like, oh, you have to do this. You have to specify as a condition or a requirement. Where did they say But you have to be careful. I mean, we can't really sit and analyze what Mr. Micawber is saying because of the way he speaks. It would just take forever. But where did he use the word stipulate? I remember reading it, but I don't see where it is. Oh. I have reconsidered that important business point, and would beg to propose my notes of hand drawn. It is needless to stipulate. So I don't have to I don't have to say this condition. I don't have to put in this condition. On stamps of the amount respectively required by the various acts of Parliament at 18, this proposition, it's really confusing what he's saying, but he's just saying, look, this is how much it's going to cost. Originally, I thought it was this, but now it's this. So it's not necessary for me to stipulate to tell you that actually I need more money. So it's not, if we want to go to Australia, it's going to cost more money. I don't have to tell you that. I don't have to tell you this if. I don't have to stipulate it because it's obvious. Arrange it in any way you please, sir, said my aunt. So the aunt is saying, yeah, well, we'll give you whatever you want. Madam, he replied, Mrs. Micawber and myself are deeply sensible of the very considerate kindness of our friends and patrons. What I wish, to be perfectly businesslike and perfectly punctual, turning over, as we are about to turn over, an entirely new leaf. To turn over a new leaf is an expression which means to start again, to start a new chapter, to be new, to be different. So if you're overweight and then you lose a lot of weight, suddenly you can say, I've turned over a new leaf. It's like a new chapter. It's like leaf means page. So turning over a new leaf means like turning a new page in your life. That's actually a pretty common expression. What I wish, to be perfectly businesslike and perfectly punctual, turning over as we are about to turn over an entirely new leaf, and falling back as we are now in the act of falling back for a spring of no common magnitude, it is important to my sense of self-respect, besides being an example to my son, that these arrangements should be concluded as between man and man and man. Patron, Miriam is asking about the word patron, and is that like friend? No, a patron is someone who gives money for something because they believe in it. So, you know, artists in for example, artists in the Renaissance or even in the 19th century, maybe even now, they usually have some rich person who loves their work so much that this rich person is always giving them money to support them, even if they're not buying the paintings, just because they want this artist to grow and become more famous or promoted. So a patron is usually someone, could be someone who buys the art, but also just giving money because they want to support that. That's and I think the word patron, you know, comes from like pater, like father. So I think that's where it comes from, like a father supporting a child. But usually when it's used, it means someone who supports something with money. Another word for customer is patron. So the patrons of the store were disappointed when it closed. That means the customers who always went there were disappointed. And in Mr. Micawber's case, who always needs money from other people, he relies on patrons. He relies on people who will support him financially because they like him or believe in him. I don't know that Mr. Micawber attached any meaning to this last phrase. I don't know that anybody ever does or did. But he appeared to relish. We've had that word several times. Relish means enjoy. He appeared to relish it uncommonly and repeated with an impressive cough, as between man and man. I propose, said Mr. Micawber, bills. a convenience to the mercantile world, for which I believe we are originally indebted to the Jews, who appear to me to have had a devilish deal too much to do with them ever since, because they are negotiable. But if a bond or any other description of security would be preferred, I should be happy to execute any such instrument as between man and man. My aunt observed that in a case where both parties were willing to agree to anything, she took it for granted that there would be no difficulty in settling this point. Mr. Micawber was of her opinion. "In reference to our domestic preparations, madam," said Mr. Micawber, with some pride, "for meeting the destiny to which we are now understood to be self-devoted, I beg to report them. My eldest daughter attends at 5 every morning in a neighborhood establishment to acquire the process, if process it may be called, of milking cows." So his daughter is learning how to milk cows in preparation for their trip to Australia. "My younger children are instructed to observe as closely as circumstances will permit the habits of pigs and poultry maintained in the poorer parts of the city." And he's encouraging his younger children to learn about the pigs that they can find in the city and poultry. Poultry, it has anything to do with chickens. Eating chicken, raising chickens, eggs, that's all poultry. A pursuit from which they have, on 2 occasions, been brought home within an inch of being run over. I have myself directed some attention during the past week to the art of baking, and my son Wilkins has issued forth with a walking stick and driven cattle, when permitted by the rugged hirelings who had them in charge to render any voluntary service in that direction, which I regret to say, for the credit of our nature, was not often, he being generally warned with imprecations to decease. What's an imprecation? A spoken curse. Miriam is asking about the word render. I don't remember even reading that word. Well, you know, if you ever use image software, like making videos, for example, if you ever use software to make videos, you will see this word render. Because, you know, in the workspace, when you're editing a video, you put words, you put different pictures, you arrange things, but this is not the end result. You still have to take all of that and put it to, the computer still has to take all of that and put it together into like an MP4 format or whatever, a .mov format. And that is called rendering. That's like taking something from concept into reality. It's the same if you're making an animation. You know, you could use the animation software, make the person move around, but it isn't really an animation until the software puts it all together into a video form. So that's rendering it, taking it from the concept into reality. But how is render used here? To render to render a service means to offer a service. Wait, let me render a service. Services rendered are services that a company completes for the customer prior to receiving payment. So imagine the idea of, oh, will you bake a cake for me? Sure. All right, when I see the cake, after you have made it and I can see it and I can take it, then I will pay you. That's paying someone for services rendered. So, you talk about the service as an idea, but that's only one thing. Another thing is when it's completed and it exists in the world, and that's when the service has been rendered. It's when you've taken it from concept into reality. All very right indeed, said my aunt encouragingly. Mr. Micawber has been busy too, I have no doubt. My dear madam, returned Mrs. Micawber, with her business-like air, I am free to confess that I have not been actively engaged in pursuits immediately connected with the cultivation or with stock, though well aware that both will claim my attention on a foreign shore. Such opportunities as I have been enabled to alienate from my domestic duties I have devoted to corresponding at some length with my family. For I own it seems to me, my dear Copperfield, said Mrs. Micawber, who always fell back on me, I suppose from old habit, to whomsoever else she might address her discourse at starting, that the time is come when the past should be buried in oblivion, when my family should take Mr. Micawber by the hand, and Mr. Micawber should take my family by the hand, when the lion shall lie down with the lamb, and my family be on terms with Mr. Micawber. I said I thought so too. So Mrs. Micawber, who speaks like her husband, is saying that before they leave for Australia, she wants Mr. Micawber and her family to finally get along. Miriam is saying, take by the hand. Well, when you take someone by the hand, you're leading them. So, here's my hand, take my hand. And then when you take my hand, then I can lead you. When you take someone by the hand, you guide them through something. So imagine if you're studying something very difficult. Imagine, for me, that would be something like math. I hate numbers. So I get very confused if I have to do complicated math. I need someone, an expert, to guide me and say, now first you do this, and then you do that, and then you do that. That's taking me by the hand. I don't understand this. Can you please take me by the hand and show me? So it's like, okay, come here, take my hand. First do this, and then you do this, and then you do that. That's take by the hand as an expression. It's like guiding somebody very slowly through a difficult process. But here, it just means to become friends. Like, here's my hand. Please take it. Let's not fight anymore. Because Mrs. Micawber's family hates Mr. Micawber. So she's just saying, I want them to be friends before we go. This, at least, is the light, my dear Mr. Copperfield, pursued Mrs. Micawber, in which I view the subject. When I lived at home with my papa and mamma, my papa was accustomed to ask when at any point was under discussion in our limited circle, in what light does my Emma view the subject? That my papa was too partial, I know. Still, on such a point as the frigid coldness which has ever subsisted between Mr. Micawber and my family, I necessarily have formed an opinion, delusive though it may be. No doubt, of course, you have, ma'am, said my aunt. Precisely so, assented Mrs. Micawber. Miriam is asking about the word subsist. Subsist means like to survive. Let me just check that. I don't remember reading that word. Subsist. To maintain or support oneself, especially at a minimal level. So that's like to subside, to survive. Where was that word? Oh, here we go. That my papa was too partial. To be too partial means that you prefer one thing over another thing, that you have a bias. So her father, I'm not sure exactly what she's talking about, but her father always wanted her opinion. He cared about her opinion more than other people's. He was partial to her. That my papa was too partial, I know. Still, on such a point is the frigid coldness that has ever subsisted. So there's a coldness that has survived all these years between Mr. Micawber and Mrs. Micawber's family. I necessarily have formed an opinion, delusive though it may be. No doubt, of course, you have, ma'am, said my aunt. Precisely so, assented Mrs. Micawber. Now, I may be wrong in my conclusions. It is very likely that I am, but my individual impression is that the gulf, that means like the space, the gap, the gulf between my family and Mr. Micawber may be traced to an apprehension on the part of my family that Mr. Micawber would require pecuniary accommodation. So she's saying the reason my family never likes Mr. Micawber is because they think he always wants money from them. Which I think is true, or at least Mrs. Micawber is always asking money from them. I cannot help thinking, said Mrs. Micawber with an air of deep sagacity. We've had that word sagacity before, but I've forgotten what it means. Sagacity, the quality of being sagacious. Oh, that's helpful. All right, let's look up sagacious. Having or showing keen mental discernment and good judgment, being shrewd. How are they using it here? I do not know. Mr. Micawber, where's sagacity? Oh, here. Mrs. Micawber, with an air of deep sagacity, so with a deep of, like, very sensible perception. Very clear thinking. With an air of deep sagacity, there are members of my family who have been apprehensive that Mr. Micawber would solicit means asking for, would solicit them for their names. And what that means is ask them for their names so he can borrow money against their names at banks. So ask them for permission to use their names for credit at a bank. I do not mean to be conferred in baptism upon our children, but to be inscribed on bills of exchange and negotiated in the money market. The look of penetration with which Mrs. Micawber announced this discovery, as if no one had ever thought of it before, seemed rather to astonish my aunt, who abruptly replied, "Well, ma'am, upon the whole, I shouldn't wonder if you were right." So this is like a new idea that Mrs. Micawber has had, but everybody knows that Mr. Micawber is always trying to borrow money from people. But she's never realized it, even after all these years. So she thinks she's some kind of perceptive genius, that she now understands this, and everybody else is like, you never noticed that before? Mr. Micawber, being now on the eve of casting off pecuniary shackles, and to have so long enthralled him, said Mrs. Micawber, and the commencing of a new career in a country where there is sufficient range for his abilities, which in my opinion is exceedingly important, Mr. Micawber's ability peculiarly requiring space, it seems to me that my family should signalize the occasion by coming forward. What I could wish to see, what would be a meeting between Mr. Micawber and my family at a festive entertainment, to be given at my family's expense, where Mr. Micawber's health and prosperity being proposed by some leading member of my family Mr. Micawber might have an opportunity of developing his views. So before they go to Australia, she wants her family to invite them and celebrate them, especially Mr. Micawber, and give him a little bit of honor and dignity before they leave. "My dear," said Mr. Micawber with some heat, "it may be better for me to state distinctly at once that if I were to develop my views to that assembled group, they would possibly be found of an offensive nature." So Mr. Micawber is saying, no, if we go there, this could be a big problem. I hate those people. They would possibly be found, my impression being that your family, in the aggregate, impertinent snobs, and in detail, unmitigated ruffians. "Micawber," said Mrs. Micawber, shaking her head, "no! You have never understood them, and they have never understood you." Mr. Micawber coughed. "They have never understood you, Mr. Micawber," said his wife. "They may be incapable of it. If so, that is their misfortune. I can pity their misfortune." "I'm extremely sorry, my dear Emma," said Mrs. Micawber, Mr. Micawber relenting, "to have been betrayed into any expressions that might even remotely have the appearance of being strong expressions. All I would say is that I can go abroad without your family coming forward to favor me. In short, with a parting shove of their cold shoulders, and that, upon the whole, I would rather leave England with such impetus as I possess than derive any acceleration of it from that quarter. At the same time, my dear," I just want to look up the word impetus. That's one of those words you hear sometimes, but I don't really... Force of energy with which the body moves. "I would rather leave English with such impetus, like my own force, as I possess, than derive any acceleration of it from that quarter. At the same time, my dear, if they should condescend to reply to your communications, which our joint experience renders most improbable." So here we have the word render again, which meaning, he's saying, well, if they reply to your letter, but we know that they won't because we've done this before. And so this idea of them replying is rendered improbable. When you think about it materializing in reality, probably not. It's probably not going to happen. As an idea, it works, but in reality, it doesn't render into reality. It doesn't come into reality ever. That's kind of a complicated word, render. It's useful when you're talking about software and making things with computers. It's used quite a bit. But I don't know if it's used very much outside of that. Miriam says, could it mean cause? Maybe it's closer to result. Cause and result. It's somewhere mixed. We've used the word mingle quite a bit recently. It's kind of a mingling of cause and result. And reality. What happens in reality? What is the result in reality? Let's just look at the word render, just the definition of render. If you Google render, it says cause or become or make. But I just like to think of it as going from idea form, like abstract form, into reality form. I think that's a good way of thinking about it. At the same time, my dear, if they should condescend to reply to your communications, which our joint experience renders most improbable, far be it from me to be a barrier to your wishes. The matter thus amicably being settled, Mr. Micawber gave Mrs. Micawber his arm, and glancing at the heap of books and papers lying before Traddles on the table, said they would leave us to ourselves, which they ceremoniously did. My dear Copperfield, Miriam's asking about condescend and patronize. Well, condescend, well, you know, this word patronize is kind of a complicated word. We talked about being a patron, but remember that word patron, it comes from the word father, pater, patron. So you could see the connection between using that word patron, meaning someone who supports something. So a father supports a child. But also patronize, which is a verb and comes from the same root. It means like talking to somebody like they're a child, which is a very negative thing. So if you're patronizing someone, you're acting superior to them. You're here and they're down here. And it's a very insulting thing to patronize someone. Okay, but patronize can mean two things. Patronize could mean being a customer. I patronize that store. When in that context, I understand it means I'm a customer of that store. I like giving them my money. I like to support them. It's a good place. So you use patronize to mean I support them because I like them. Okay? But if you use it in a different way, I didn't like the patronizing way in which he spoke to me. That's the same word being used as an adjective here, but it could be used as a verb. I don't like the way he patronizes me. That doesn't mean I don't like the way he gives me money. I don't like the way he's talking to me like he's up here and I'm down here. And condescend means the same thing, because condescend means going down, looking down. So if you condescend to someone, it means you're lowering yourself to their level. And that word was used quite a bit in the past. It isn't used so much more now. But when you say, I will condescend to you, that means I will be happy to make myself lower for you. So again, condescending could be bad or good. How do they use condescend here? I hope I'm not confusing you. When I'm thinking about all these different explanations, I'm thinking, God, that sounds pretty confusing. How do they use condescend here? You can only use condescend in a negative way, I think, in contemporary English. You wouldn't want to use condescend in the positive way. But I think it might have been positive here. Where was it? Oh, I wish I could find it. Oh, okay. At the same time, my dear, if they should condescend to reply to your communications, so this is kind of negative, the way that he's using it. So Mrs. Micawber is always asking her family, oh, please come and visit us and treat us with respect and be kind to us, but they hate her husband. So, and they seem to have a lot of money. And of course, the Micawbers never have money. So they feel like they're above the Micawbers. So he's saying if they feel like lowering themselves enough to answer your letter, So it is kind of a insulting way here, I think. "My dear Copperfield," said Traddles, leaning back in his chair when they were gone, and looking at me with affection that made his eyes red and his hair all kinds of shapes, "I don't make any excuse for troubling you with business, because I know you are deeply interested in it. And it may divert your thoughts, my dear boy. I hope you're not worn out." "I'm quite myself," said I, after a pause. "We have more cause to think of my aunt than anyone. You know how much she has done." "Surely, surely," answered Traddles. "Who can forget it?" "But even that is not all," said I. "During the last fortnight, some new trouble has vexed her. To be vexed means to be annoyed, or to feel bothered. Some new trouble has vexed her, and she has been in and out of London every day. Several times she has gone out early, and been absent until evening. Last night, Traddles. With this journey before her, it was almost midnight before she came home. You know what her consideration for others is. She will not tell me what has happened to distress her, so the aunt feels very distressed for some reason, and mysteriously she's been leaving London every day early in the morning and not returning until late at night, and she won't say what the reason is. I'm just going to take a 1-minute break, and I will be right back. All right. Well, let's find out what's happening with the aunt. My aunt, very pale and with deep lines in her face, sat immovable until I had finished, and when some stray tears found their way to her cheeks, she put her hand on mine. "It's nothing, Trot. It's nothing. There will be no more of it. You shall know by and by. By and by means later. Now, Agnes, my dear, let us attend to these affairs. I must do Mr. Micawber justice, to say," Traddles began, "that although he would appear not to have worked to any good account for himself, he is a most untiring man when he works for other people." So Traddles is saying, he doesn't do a very good job taking care of himself. He's always getting into trouble, but he's always very careful to take care of other people. "I never saw such a fellow. If he always goes on in the same way, he must be virtually about 200 years old at present. The heat into which he has been continually putting himself, and the distracted, impetuous manner in which he has been diving, day and night, among papers and books, to say nothing of the immense number of letters he has written me between this house and Mr. Wickfield's, and often across the table, when he has been sitting opposite, and might much more easily have spoken, is quite extraordinary. Thank you, Mike Learning has made a nice compliment and said you're doing a great job. Thank you, Mike. I appreciate it. I hope you keep watching. Letters, cried my aunt. I believe he dreams in letters. So he's saying even when we're sitting at the same table, Mr. Micawber will write a letter and hand it to me. And so the aunt cries, letters! I believe he dreams in letters. There's Mr. Dick, too, said Traddles. He's been doing wonders. As soon as he was released from overlooking Uriah Heep, whom he kept in such charge as I never saw exceeding, he began to devote himself to Mr. Wickfield, and really his anxiety to be of use in the investigations we have been making, and his real usefulness in extracting and copying and fetching and carrying have been quite stimulating to us. Dick is a very remarkable man, exclaimed my aunt, and I always said he was, Trot, you know it. I am happy to say, Miss Wickfield, pursued Traddles at once with great delicacy and with great earnestness, that in your absence Mr. Wickfield has considerably improved, relieved of the incubus that he had fastened upon himself for such a long time. An incubus is something from Greek mythology, I think, or maybe it's Roman mythology. I think it's Greek. I don't know. Right, let me see. A demon, a male demon. Let's see. Do we have any pictures of an incubus? It's like a devil. But here you can see a picture of an incubus. So the incubus that they're referring to is Uriah Heep. Uriah Heep. Relieved of this incubus, so they're saying now that Uriah is gone, that had fastened upon him for such a long time, and of the dreadful apprehensions under which he had lived, he is hardly the same person. At times, even his impaired power of concentrating his memory and attention on particular points of business has recovered itself very much. And he's been able to assist us in making some things clear that we should have found very difficult indeed, if not hopeless without him. But what I have to do is to come to results which are short enough not to gossip on all the hopeful circumstances I've observed, or I shall never have done. His natural manner and agreeable simplicity made it transparent that he said this to put us in good heart and enable Agnes to hear her father mentioned with greater confidence. But it was not the less pleasant for that. Now let me see, said Traddles, looking among the papers on the table, having counted our funds and reduced to order a great mass of unintentional confusion in the first place, and of the willful confusion and falsification in the second. We take it to be clear that Mr. Wickfield might now wind up his business. To wind something up means to finish something. So that's a very useful phrasal verb. When you wind, you have to be careful because phrasal verbs can mean many different things depending on the context. So one way that you could use wind up means to finish something, to begin to finish something, to start to finish something. And that's how they're using it here. Mr. Wickfield might now wind up his business. He might finally finish things. and his agency trust, and exhibit no deficiency or defalcation whatever. Oh, thank heaven, cried Agnes fervently. But, said Traddles, the surplus means extra, that would be left as his means of support, and I suppose the house to be sold, even in saying this, would be so small, not exceeding in all probability some hundreds of pounds, that perhaps, Miss Wickfield, it would be best to consider whether he might not retain his agency of the estate to which he has so long been receiver. His friends might advise him, you know, now he is free. You yourself, Miss Wickfield, Copperfield, I have considered it, Trotwood, said Agnes, looking to me, and I feel it ought not to be, and must not be, even on the recommendation of a friend to whom I am so grateful, and owe so much. I will not say that I recommend it, observed Traddles. I think it right to suggest it, no more. So I think they're saying, well, if he sells his business and his house, everything will be okay, but then you won't have much money, and it might be a good idea if he continues his business somehow. Maybe all of his friends can advise him about that. But the daughter says, I don't think it's a good idea to continue with the business. And Traddles is saying, well, I'm just suggesting it. I'm not recommending it. I'm just saying that's a possibility. I'm happy to hear you say so, answered Agnes steadily, for it gives me hope, almost assurance that we think alike. Dear Mr. Traddles, and dear Trotwood, Papa, once free with honor, what could I wish for? I've always aspired, if I could have released him from the toils in which he has held, to render back some little portion of the love and care I owe him, and to devote my life to him. It has been for years the utmost height of my hopes. To take our future on myself will be the next great happiness. So Agnes is saying, oh, I don't care. He doesn't have to continue in the business. He's in no condition to work. And I will be happy to work and earn money to support him. Miriam says, again, render. I didn't even notice that we used the word render again. Where was it? Render back some little portion of love. Let's see how it was used here. If I could have released him from the toils. Toil means hard work. So, if I could have released him from this, I don't think they mean hard work here, but the horrible work that he was doing because of Uriah. If I could have released him from this horrible situation which he has held, to render back some love, some little portion of love and care I owe him. So somehow I want to take all those things that he has done and somehow take from that all the love that I owe him. I don't know. That's really hard to explain, but I hope it makes a little bit of sense. It has been for years the utmost height of my hopes to take our future on myself. To take something, to take our future on. To take something on, that's another phrasal verb. And again, it could mean many things, but here it means to accept the responsibility. So she wants to accept the responsibility of their future together. She wants to go out and work and earn money to show how much she appreciates and loves him. Miriam is saying, what other word could we use besides render here? Let's see. I've always aspired, if I could have released him from the toils in which he held, and to render back some little portion of love, to take from it, to take from all of that, to extract. Do you know render can mean extract? When you take the fat from meat, I was just thinking of this when we were talking about render. To render fat means to separate it from the meat, because you could use that fat for frying things. So when the fat is like liquid, it's called rendered fat. When fat is on the meat, it's not, if there's too much of it, it's not very useful. I mean, some fat on meat tastes good, but if it's too much fat, that's kind of disgusting. But the way that fat could be useful is to melt it into a liquid and then use that for frying things like potatoes or whatever. And that's called rendered fat, when the fat is separated from the meat so that you could use it in a useful way. But maybe something like take from, if I could have released him from the toils in which he was held, to render back some little portion. To render, does render mean give? I wouldn't say that it means give. It doesn't seem like it. But I just had an idea. What if we put this line into ChatGPT and say, how else can you say this? I'm going to try that. Let's see. I'm just not creative enough to do that on my own, I guess. But ChatGPT is pretty good at this stuff, unfortunately. Let's see. If I could have released him from his toils which he held, to render back some little portion of love and care I owe him, and devote my life to him. Okay, let's see how ChatGPT says this in a different way. I'll say this in simple English. Don't use the word render. Let's see what happens. If I could have freed him from his troubles, to repay him. And so here, I think that's actually pretty good, to use repay. Freed him from his troubles, to repay him some of the love and care. Let's see. It's funny, Miriam, because you said, oh, could render mean give? And I said, well, I don't think so. I can't think of it that way. But that's actually, ChatGPT disagrees with me, because I said, well, what does render mean in this context? And it says in this context, render means to give or to provide something. So the phrase to render back, well, this is render back, which maybe is like return. Did they use the word render back? Oh yeah, it is render back. See, this is the problem with phrasal verbs. I wasn't even thinking about the preposition there, back. I was just thinking of the word render. And if you look at a word, if you just look at the verb, that always means something, almost always means something completely different from a phrasal verb. So, if you say give, that's very different from give back. Give means like to one person gives to another, but give back means return. And I wasn't thinking of this preposition back. So yeah, it could be give here. So you're oh, Miranda. Oh, I'm sorry, Miranda. The two M's. I've got the two M's today, and I always get the two M's confused. Miriam and Miranda. All right, let's see. I'm happy to hear you say so, answered Agnes steadily, for it gives me hope, almost assurance that we think alike. Dear Mr. Traddles and dear Trotwood, Papa, once free with honor, what could I wish for? I've always aspired, if I could have released him from the toils in which he was held, to render back, to give back, some little portion of the love and care I owe him, and to devote my life to him. It has been for years the utmost height of my hopes to take our future on myself will be the next great happiness, the next to his release from all trust and responsibility that I can know. Have you thought how, Agnes? Often. I'm not afraid, dear Trotwood. I'm certain of success. So many people know me here and think kindly of me that I am certain. Don't mistrust me. Our wants are not many. If I rent the dear old house and keep a school, I shall be useful and happy. The calm fervor of her cheerful voice brought back so vividly the first dear old house itself, and then my solitary home, that my heart was too full for speech. Traddles pretended for a little while to be busily looking among the papers. "Next, Miss Trotwood," said Traddles, "that property of yours." "Well, sir," sighed my aunt, "all I've got to say about it is that if it's gone, I can bear it, and if it's not gone, I shall be glad to get it back." "It was originally, I think, £8,000. Consols," said Traddles. "Right," replied my aunt. "I can't account for more than 5, said Traddles, with an air of perplexity. "1,000, do you mean?" inquired my aunt, with an uncommon composure, "or pounds?" £5,000, said Traddles. It was all there was," returned my aunt. "I sold 3 myself. I paid for your articles, Trot, my dear, and the other 2 I have by me. When I lost the rest, I thought it wise to say something about that sum, but to keep it secretly for a rainy day. When you save something for a rainy day, that means you save it for an emergency. So she was keeping £2,000, and she didn't tell anybody about it, just in case there was some kind of emergency where it was absolutely necessary to have some money. That's saving something for a rainy day. I wanted to see how you would come out of the trial, Trot, and you came out nobly, persevering, self-reliant, self-denying. So, Dick, don't speak to me, for I find my nerves a little shaken." Nobody would have thought so, to see her sitting upright with her arms folded, but she had wonderful self-command. "Then I'm delighted to say," cried Traddles, beaming with joy, "that we have recovered the whole money." "Don't congratulate me, anybody," exclaimed my aunt. "How so, sir?" You believed it had been misappropriated. If something is misappropriated, that means it was supposed to be used for one thing, but they used it for something different. You always see that word misappropriate when talking about money, with the government, especially the government, misusing money. They say that it's for this, and then they use it for something else. But it could also be used in financial fraud, or something like that. Misused. It's kind of like misused. "You believed it had been misappropriated by Mr. Wickfield," said Traddles. "Of course I did," said my aunt, "and was therefore easily silenced. Agnes, not a word." "And indeed," said Traddles, "it was sold by virtue of the power of management he held from you. But I needn't say by whom sold, or on whose actual signature. It was afterwards pretended to be Mr. Wickfield by that rascal." A rascal is a bad person, usually a male. I don't think you would ever call a female a rascal. But a rascal is someone always getting into trouble. Maybe you call a little girl a rascal. "You little rascal." And proved, too, by figures, that he had possessed himself of the money, on general instructions, he said, to keep other deficiencies and difficulties to light. Mr. Wickfield being so weak and helpless in his hands as to pay you, afterwards, several sums of interest on a pretended principle which he knew did not exist, made himself unhappily a party to the fraud. Well, I don't understand what happened here, but it seems like the aunt's house was sold, but it wasn't really sold. I'm not sure what happened. It's a little complicated. And at last took the blame upon himself, added my aunt, and wrote me a mad letter charging himself with robbery and wrong unheard of, upon which I paid him a visit early one morning, called for a candle, burnt the letter, and told him if he ever could write me himself to do it. And if he couldn't, to keep his own counsel for his daughter's sake. If anybody speaks to me, I'll leave the house. So one day Mr. Wickfield wrote her a letter. I'm a horrible person. I sold your house. I've ruined you. I'm sorry. I don't know what I did. And then the aunt came and visited and said, look, I'm never going to tell anybody about this, but if you could repay me one day, then you have to repay me. And if you can't, I'll never tell anyone what happened. And now she's saying, nobody speak. We all remained quiet, Agnes covering her face. Well, my dear friend, said my aunt after a pause, and you have really extorted the money back from him? Why, the fact is, returned Traddles, Mr. Micawber had so completely hemmed him in, and was always ready with so many points if an old one failed, that he could not escape from us. As most remarkable circumstance is, that I really don't think he grasped the sum, even so much for the gratification of his own avarice, which was inordinate, as in the hatred he felt for Copperfield. He said to me plainly, he said he would have spent as much to balk or injure Copperfield. Ha! Said my aunt, knitting her brows thoughtfully and glancing at Agnes. And what's become of him? Miriam is asking about avarice. Oh, let's define that. Avarice is an excessive or insatiable desire for wealth. So greed, it's another word for being greedy. And extort, when you, I don't know if you know the term blackmail, but extortion is kind of like blackmail. So if you do this, I'm going to do this. It's kind of like threatening someone to, well, I better look it up. I don't like my definition. Extortion. It's what bad people do to force other people to give them money. The crime of obtaining something from someone, especially money, by using force or threats. So that wasn't such a bad definition after all. So the aunt asks, what's become of him? That means what happened to him? Where is Uriah Heep now? I don't know. He left here, said Traddles, with his mother, who had been clamoring and beseeching is begging, and disclosing the whole time. They went away by one of the London night coaches, and I know no more about him, except that his malevolence to me at parting was audacious. He seemed to consider himself hardly less indebted to me than to Mr. Micawber, which I consider, as I told him, quite a compliment. Do you suppose he has any money? I asked. Oh dear, yes, I should think so, he replied, shaking his head seriously. I should say he must have pocketed a good deal in one way or other, but I think you would find, Copperfield, if you had an opportunity of observing his course, that money would never keep that man out of mischief. Mischief is when you're doing bad things. He put in such an incarnate hypocrite. He is such an incompetent... Miranda saying knit her brows can be used or is Old English. Well, you can't say Old English because Old English is term used for English of like 1,000 years ago, which is a very different type of English. So maybe older English would be a better way of saying that. But no, knitting your brows is when you... I can't do it. Let me get a picture. People use it. People still use it. You'll see that in books and things like that. I don't know if people say it in regular speech, but let's see if we can find a picture of what that means. Okay. It's like a look of suspicion. Knitted brows, like the brow, maybe the brows go down. I'm like, what are you talking about? Or a little bit of anger, a little bit of aggression, a little bit of curiosity. These are, well, not all of these people. I think just the first few pictures show that very well. Go back up to the top. Something like this woman here. Like you're asking a question and you're a little bit suspicious, maybe. But it's not old-fashioned. I think it's just that you might read that in a book. You're more likely to read that in a book than to actually hear somebody say it. He is such an incarnate hypocrite that whatever object he pursues, he must pursue crookedly. So if somebody is crooked, that means they cheat people. They like to lie and cheat and steal. So they're saying he's such a horrible person that whatever he must do it like a horrible person. He must lie and cheat and steal. He's a crooked person. Crooked is the opposite of straight. That's, I think we've used that word before. We've talked about it before. But let's see what happens if I just... So, you know, if you think of a tree, you normally think of a tree looking like up and down, like this. So when you see a tree that's shaped in this strange way, you can call that a crooked tree. Here's a crooked... Is it really a crooked nose? Well, yeah, it is a little crooked. So you expect it to be straight up and down, but if it's a little bit like that, that means it's crooked. Here's again, another example. You expect this house to be like a normal house, but it's not. It's like this. It's a crooked house. But crooked also means like a bad or a liar or a cheater. A criminal. It's kind of another word for criminal. Someone who doesn't do things honestly. Miranda says, oh yes, you're right. You meant to use in contemporary English, am sleepy, I asked, because I found this expression in my dictionary, but not in the online dictionary. Yeah, I mean, it's not a common phrase in spoken English, but it's definitely common when people are narrating stories in a book, perhaps. It's his only compensation for the outward restraints he puts on himself, always creeping along on the ground to some small end or other. He will always magnify every object in the way, and consequently will hate and suspect everybody that comes in the most innocent manner between him and it. So the crooked courses will become crookeder. At any moment, for the least reason, or for none, it's only necessary to consider his history there, said Traddles, to know that. Really, he's a monster of meanness, said my aunt. Really, I don't know about that, observed Traddles thoughtfully. Many people can be very mean when they give their minds to it. And now, "Touching Mr. Micawber," said my aunt. "Well, really," said Traddles cheerfully, "I must once more give Mr. Micawber high praise. But for his having been so patient and persevering for so long a time, we never could have hoped to do anything worth speaking of. And I think we ought to consider that Mr. Micawber did right, for right's sake." So that phrase, "he did right for right's sake," means he didn't do the right thing because he was expecting money. He just did it because it was the right thing to do. When we reflect what terms he might have made with Uriah Heep himself for his silence. So Mr. Micawber had the option of saying, "Give me some money, or I'll tell everybody what you did." But instead, he exposed Uriah Heep for being a criminal and didn't ask for any money from anyone. "I think so too," said I. "Now what would you give him?" inquired my aunt. "Oh, before you come to that," said Traddles, a little disconcerted, "I'm afraid I thought it discreet to omit, not being able to carry everything before me, 2 points in making this lawless judgment. For it's perfectly lawless from beginning to end of a difficult affair, those IOUs and so forth, which Mr. Micawber gave him for advances he had." "Well, they must be paid," said my aunt. "Yes, but I don't know when they may be proceeded upon, or where they are," rejoined Traddles, opening his eyes. "And I anticipate that between this time and his departure, Mr. Micawber will constantly be arrested or taken in execution." "Then he must constantly be set free again and taken out of execution," said my aunt. "What's the amount altogether?" "Why, Mr. Micawber has entered the transactions, he calls them transactions with great form, in a book," rejoined Traddles, smiling, "and he makes the amount £103.5. "Now what shall we give him, that sum included?" said my aunt Agnes. "Agnes, my dear, you and I can talk about division of it afterwards. What should it be, £500? Upon this, Traddles and I struck in at once. We both recommended a small sum in money, and the payment, without stipulation to Mr. Micawber, of the Uriah claims as they came in. We proposed that the family should have their passage and their outfit and £100, and that Mr. Micawber's arrangement for the repayment of the advances should be gravely entered into, as it might be wholesome for him to suppose himself under that responsibility. "Only £100? I think that's maybe like $150,000, or £150,000, or £170,000 in today's money. But I think he deserves more. He saved everybody." I added the suggestion that I should give some explanation of his character and history to Mr. Peggotty, who I knew could be relied on, and that Mr. Peggotty should be quietly entrusted the discretion of advancing another 100. I further proposed to maybe give Mr. Peggotty, who is traveling with them, £100 to provide Mr. Micawber on their trip, so that he doesn't get into more debt or more trouble along the way. So it's £200. I further proposed to interest Mr. Micawber in Mr. Peggotty by confiding so much of Mr. Peggotty's story to him as I might feel justified in relating, or I might think expedient, and to endeavor to bring each of them to bear upon the other for the common advantage. We all entered warmly into these views, and I may mention at once that the principals themselves did so shortly afterwards, with perfect goodwill and harmony. Seeing that Traddles now glanced anxiously at my aunt, again I reminded him of the second and last point to which he had adverted. You and your aunt will excuse me, Copperfield, if I touch upon the painful theme, as I greatly fear I shall, said Traddles, hesitating. But I think it necessary to bring it to your recollection. On the day of Mr. Micawber's memorable denunciation, a threatening allusion was made by Uriah to your aunt's husband. My aunt, retaining her stiff position and apparent composure, assented with a nod. Perhaps, observed Traddles, it was mere purposeless impertinence. No, returned my aunt. There was, pardon me, really such a person, and at all in his power, hinted Traddles. Yes, my good friend, said my aunt. Traddles, with a perceptible lengthening of his face, explained that he had not been able to approach this subject, and that it had shared the fate of Mr. Micawber's liabilities in not being comprehended in terms he had made, that we no longer of any authority with Uriah Heep, and that he could do us, or any of us, an injury or annoyance. No doubt he would. So they're still worried that Uriah Heep might try to bother them somehow. My aunt remained quiet until again some stray tears found their way back to her cheeks. You're quite right, she said. It was very thoughtful to mention it. Can I or Copperfield do anything? Asked Traddles gently. Nothing, said my aunt. I thank you many times, Trot, my dear, a vain threat. Let us have Mr. and Mrs. Micawber back. And don't any of you speak to me. With that, she smoothed her dress and sat with her upright carriage, looking at the door. Well, Mr. and Mrs. Micawber, said my aunt when they entered, we have been discussing your emigration, with my apologies to you for keeping you out of the room so long, and I'll tell you what arrangements we propose. These she explained to the unbounded satisfaction of the family, children and all being then present, and so much to the awakening of Mr. Micawber's punctual habits in the opening stage of all bill transactions, that he could not be dissuaded from immediately rushing out in the highest of spirits to buy the stamps for his notes of hand. But his joy received a sudden check, for within 5 minutes he returned in the custody of a sheriff's officer, informing us, in a flood of tears, that all was lost, we being quite prepared for this event, which was, of course, a proceeding of Uriah Heep's, soon paid the money. So before Uriah left, he informed the sheriff that Mr. Micawber was in the city and he should be arrested because he owes a lot of money to people. They already knew this would happen, and they were ready. They were prepared for that. And in 5 minutes more, Mr. Micawber was seated at the table, filling up the stamps with an expression of perfect joy, which only the congenial employment of the making of punch could impart a full completeness of his shining face. To see him at work on the stamps with the relish of an artist. Remember, relish means the enjoying. Touching them like pictures, looking at them sideways, taking weighty notes of the dates and amounts in his pocket, and then contemplating them when finished, with the high sense of their precious value, was a sight indeed. Now, the best thing you can do, sir, if you'll allow me to advise you, said my aunt, after silently observing him, is to abjure that occupation for evermore. Madam, replied Mr. Micawber. Let's see what abjure means. I think I've looked that up before, but I don't remember. Reject. Reject or renounce something. I'm not sure which occupation she's referring to. All he was doing was putting stamps on things. Madam, replied Mr. Micawber, it is not my intention to register such a vow on the virgin page of the future. Mrs. Micawber will attest it. I trust, said Mr. Micawber solemnly, that my son Wilkins will ever bear in mind that he had infinitely better put his fist in the fire than use it to handle the serpents that have poisoned the lifeblood of his unhappy parent. Deeply affected and changed in a moment to the image of despair, Mr. Micawber regarded the serpents with a look of gloomy abhorrence, in which his late admiration of them was not quite subdued, folded them up, and put them in his pocket. This closed the proceedings of the evening. We were weary with sorrow and fatigue, and my aunt and I were to return to London on the morrow. It was arranged that the Micawbers should follow us, after effecting a sale of their goods to a broker, that Mr. Wickfield's affairs should be brought to a settlement, with all convenient speed, under the direction of Traddles, and that Agnes should come to London pending those arrangements, and we passed the night in the old house, which freed from the presence of the heaps, seemed purged of disease, and I lay in my old room like a shipwrecked wanderer come home. We went back the next day to my aunt's house, not to mine, and when she and I sat alone, as of old, before going to bed, she said, "Trot, do you really wish to know what I have had upon my mind lately?" "Indeed I do, Aunt. If there ever was a time that I felt unwilling that you should have a sorrow or anxiety which I could not share, it is now." "You've had sorrow enough, child," said my aunt affectionately, "without the addition of my little miseries. I could have no other motive, Trot, in keeping anything from you." "I know that well," said I, "but tell me now." "Would you ride with me a little way tomorrow morning?" asked my aunt. "Of course." "At 9, she said. "I'll tell you then, my dear." At 9, accordingly, we went out in a little chariot and drove to London. We drove a long way through the streets until we came to one of the large hospitals. Standing hard by the building was a plain hearse. A hearse is the vehicle that holds a dead body. A hearse is the vehicle that takes a dead body to the place where it will stay forever, where it will stay in the ground or wherever you're keeping the dead body. The driver recognized my aunt, and in obedience to a motion of her hand at the window, drove slowly off, we following. "You understand it now, Trot," said my aunt. "He's gone." "Did he die in the hospital?" "Yes." She sat immovable beside me, but again I saw the stray tears on her face. "He was there once before," said my aunt presently. "He was ailing a long time. A shattered, broken man, these many years. When we knew his state in the last illness, he asked them to send for me. He was very sorry then. Very sorry." "You went, I know, Aunt." "I went. I was with him a good deal afterwards." "He died the night before we went to Canterbury," said I. My aunt nodded. "No one can harm him now," she said. It was a vain threat. We drove away out of town to the churchyard at Hornsey. "Better here than in the streets," said my aunt. "He was born here." We alighted and followed the plain coffin to a corner I remember well, where the service was read, consigning it to dust. 36 years ago this day, my dear," said my aunt, as we walked back to the chariot, "I was married." Well, I didn't know that she was that old, so she must be 80. Oh, 36. Sorry. 6 and 30. 36. Okay, no. So she's maybe, if she was married when she was maybe 20, 36. So she's almost 60. Okay, that's better. That's not what I pictured. An 80-year-old woman. He was a fine-looking man when I married him, Trot. Oh, wait. I skipped something. 36 years ago, this day, my dear. So this day, the day they're burying him, was the day that they were married, 36 years ago. As we walked back to the chariot, I was married. God forgive us all. We took our seats in silence, and so she sat beside me for a long time, holding my hand. At length, she suddenly burst into tears and said, "He was a fine-looking man when I married him, Trot, and he was sadly changed." It did not last long. After the relief of tears, she soon became composed and even cheerful. Her nerves were a little shaken. She said she would not have given way to it. God forgive us all. So we rode back to her little cottage at Highgate, where we found the following short note, which had arrived by the morning's post, from Mr. Micawber. Friday. My dear Madam and Copperfield, the fair land of promise lately looming on the horizon is again enveloped in impenetrable mists and forever withdrawn from the eyes of a drifting wretch whose doom is sealed. Another writ has been issued, so he's in trouble again. The police have got him again. He owes all of this money, and they know that this is going to happen, that he'll keep getting arrested and being put in prison, and they'll have to keep getting him out of prison by paying his debts. They already know that this is going to happen, so it's no surprise. Another writ has been issued in His Majesty's High Court of King's Bench at Westminster, in another cause of Heap versus Micawber, and the defendant in that cause is the prey of the sheriff, having legal jurisdiction in his bailiwick. Now's the day and now's the hour, see the front of battle lower. See approach proud Edward's power, chains and slavery, consigned to which and to a speedy end, for mental torture is not supportable beyond a certain point, and that point, I feel, I have attained. My course is in run. Bless you, bless you. Some future traveler, visiting from motives of curiosity, not unmingled, let us hope, with sympathy, the place of confinement allotted to debtors in this city, and I trust will ponder as he traces on its will, inscribed with a rusty nail, the obscure initials W.M. P.S. I reopen this to say that our common friend, Mr. Thomas Traddles, who has not yet left us and is looking extremely well, has paid the debt and costs in the whole noble name of Miss Trotwood, and that myself and my family are at the height of earthly bliss. Okay. Miranda's asking about the word consign. Well, let's look that word up. Consign. Consign, usually in the time that you would probably use this in a practical way, it's if you've ever taken an object to a store and you say, "Can you sell this item for me?" And you can keep 15% of the cost. That's called consignment. And that's probably how you would use that word consign. But here, consign. Deliver. Deliver is probably how it's being used. Where did he say the word consign? Consigned to which and to a speedy end. Wait, it's so hard to read it's so hard to understand what Mr. Micawber is saying. So he's saying there's a trial about to happen, Heap versus Micawber in the court. And then he says, consigned to which, meaning I was delivered to the court, that I'm now in prison. So that's how he's using it here. All right, well, that was the end of chapter 54 of David Copperfield. Wow, we are getting so close to the end. Only about 130 more pages. I can't believe it. It's been a very long book. All right, well, thank you for staying and asking questions, and thank you for all of your comments. And I hope you come back again when we read through chapter 55. That might be tonight. That might be in about 4.5 hours. We'll see if I'm tired of talking by then. So I hope that you come back and watch. And thank you for watching today. Goodbye.